is the internet one of those third rail issues that the people in this building, or at least up a couple sub-basements from where we are, actually can be afraid of? And how do we take these political moments and actually translate them into political movements?
Yeah, I think we should recognize this is an incredibly important and wonderful moment. And it's produced because somebody let Barack Obama, he escaped. So I don't know where he was for 6 years, but now he's back. And he's delivering finally on the promise which he said. And he exercised an extraordinary leadership. And then Chairman Wheeler, chairman of the SEC, former lobbyist, chairman of the SEC, whose initial utterances about net neutrality made it sound like he didn't believe in network neutrality. He came around and has taken an extraordinary leadership inside the SEC. So, Nixon went to China, Lyndon Johnson gave us civil rights, Chairman Wheeler gave us network neutrality. This is like the way this stuff works in the city. And it's an important victory because I do think it establishes a fundamental principle that will be powerful. Now here's the cynical view. And this was an argument that the great Susan Crawford wrote up in Medea. The cynical view is this is just the opening salvo in a fight that will eventually lead to the reopening of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And the opening of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 is an event that will shower millions of dollars on congressmen on all sides of the aisle. So if this event gives them an excuse to have the fight about rewriting the telecommunications law, the objective is to do this in a way that helps them fund campaigns. And how network neutrality survives that fight, I'm not as optimistic about. But right now, we've achieved, and we should mark, and we should celebrate an important victory. And I don't think you're going to see enormous pushback, despite the lobbyists making a lot of noise about it right now, because they see that the internet has been teed up by organizations. I mean, you've been in this fight for as long as anybody, but organizations that have finally rallied literally millions to care and to fight to make this happen.
So I'm probably a little more optimistic, but only if some of what you're talking about in your presentation comes to pass, if this truly is one of those sparks, if we can take people on that journey from geek to citizen and engage them. So at risk of asking far too simplistic a question, how do we do that? How do we unite these disparate movements? How do we get all of these people? We talked about a liberal libertarian coalition. We talked about all these people who are motivated for these moments. And the internet is really good at that, getting people's attention for a short amount of time, giving them something to do, and combined with people who are willing to walk across the entire state of New Hampshire.
Yeah, so I think films like this are perfect for doing that. Because what's great about this film is, and I was afraid of this fact when I first understood the design of the film, is that it pulls together a whole bunch of different issues in a way that gives people an opportunity to reflect on what's actually driving all of this. Like, what is the thing that's making all of this fail? So if you have somebody going to the doctor and they're having heart failure and having trouble with their lungs and their livers are having problems with their liver and they've got problems with their legs, it's not like you've got 7 different things you've got to deal with. You've got some underlying problem that you've got to address if you're going to solve any of the other problems. And I think that moments like this, we begin to get a glimpse of what really is happening. So I remember in the SOPA fight, there's a radical surprise here in Washington about exactly how much could be motivated to stop that bill. And the initial motivation was framed around the ideas of internet censorship and the idea that the fight against piracy was a fight to control the architecture. And that was incredibly successful in rallying people. But after the fight was over, there was a kind of pivot, and people understood that really what was underlying the reason for this fight was exactly the corruption that Aaron was talking about. And I think that the more we can have these examples drive people to understand that dynamic, the greater the chance is that we'll finally find a way to do something about it. But here's the critical thing that, again, makes me feel weird about this film being shown here. It's not going to happen here. I mean, they're great members of Congress. They're they're great members of Congress. Alan Grayson is amazing. There are lots of fantastic leaders here, but it will not happen here. It will only happen when people outside of here, Republicans and Democrats alike, finally come around to recognizing that we can't live with this type of corrupted government. We just can't survive. And they will finally step up and force some kind of change to happen.
Well, let's take a few questions.
Yes, thank you for the film and the work, and
tell us who you are.
Medea
Anybody who's
Benjamin
asking
with
for-
Code Pink. One particular part of that film that really resonated with me was showing James Clapper being questioned by Senator Wyden when he just blatantly lied and said that the government was not collecting information on American citizens, and then he said, well, not unwittingly. Unwittingly he was doing. And I wonder what you would say to James Clapper if you had a chance. And you would have a chance, and so would everybody in this room, if you want to, tomorrow morning at 9:30, where he is testifying on the global threats. And I think we as citizens, and I really get this so much from the film, don't do enough to confront our government officials, especially when they lie to us. Those of us who do it on a regular basis, like today, we're in jail. But if you do it for your first time, you only get a $50 fine. And I would be very happy to pay anybody's $50 fine who would come tomorrow to Dirksen at 9:30 in the morning.
No.
And no conviction record either, Medea.
No, get there at 8.
Well, get there as early as you can. We'll give you our spots.
Dirksen 106.
Dirksen 106. And what would you say, or what could anybody here say to him if you come tomorrow morning? And please, some of you come. That would be so much fun. And we'll be there to cheer you on.
Yeah, it's astonishing to watch that testimony, given what we know he knew and what was true. But when I look at these examples like that, I like to separate people who we think might be acting really badly, which I think he was, from a system behind that person, which is a little invisible, but is really ultimately responsible for the extreme position that person is pushing. So as much as there are people who were obsessed with the fear of terror and did all sorts of things in the name of fighting terror, there's also a multi-billion-dollar industry that's driving to expand the infrastructure of surveillance, not because they have a keen idea of how to keep America safe, but because they realize there's a huge amount of money to be made in that system. So, Snowden is working in Booz Allen, which is has a huge consulting relationship to the United States government. It's the military-industrial intelligence congressional complex now, which I think ultimately is the thing we have to be most worried about. Because, the reality, I think, after 9/11 is a lot of good people were just terrified. And some good people who were terrified did things which I think now they look back on and they think was the craziness of the moment. And what we haven't learned how to do is to kind of have a morning after. Like, when you're in college and you have a crazy night and you wake up and you say, oh, okay, I did a lot of stupid things. That was really bad. Like that. You have a way of separating it out. We just haven't had that about, 9/11. I think, between the stuff that the NSA did, which is stuff that we've done, to the rest of the world with wars. This is all, I think, crazy, but understandable crazy in the face of that fear. And what's not understandable, I think, and not acceptable is our inability to step back from it and just say it was wrong, and we have to move on. We have to say that was wrong. We have to hold people responsible to the extent we can, and we have to move on from it, looking at the real problem, which even if we move on, if we don't address this underlying money problem, I don't think we're going to be able to solve any of those other problems either.
So we're definitely going to get a few more questions. I did a bad job as moderator by not saying, and I, of course, exempt Medea from this because she's put on a lot more on the line than most of us. But we do love questions and short statements. So think about a couple sentences. And as for motivation, think about it letting other people talk, and it's what's standing between you and drinks, possibly alcoholic drinks. So,
They are alcoholic, yes.
oh, and they are even, okay. So
I mean, if you want them to be.
we have some folks over here. I saw some hands down in the front.
Thank you. Manny Roppolo with RT America. Professor Lessig, first of all, congratulations on the film and to the filmmakers as well. It's a beautiful film. You talk about preserving net neutrality through a shift in social consciousness. Well, how do we do that? I'm sorry, there's about 3 or 4 cameras that I can see here. How do we make this a mainstream issue? How do we do this before, like you said, the next generation is radicalized? How do we achieve that before the next SOPA, before the next CISPA, before the next piece of dangerous draconian legislation?
That's a really hard question because, when people were talking about network neutrality, that was a revision on the earlier rhetoric, which was the fight to preserve end-to-end architecture of the internet. Tim Wu came along and said, that's an idiotic way to talk about this. Nobody's going to know what that means. Let's change it to network neutrality. And that's what gave birth to the network neutrality movement. And I think that was a brilliant shift. And over time, there's been an enormous number of people who have come to recognize the importance of defending this network neutrality. I remember testifying with Code Pink and some right-wing Christian Bible people before the Senate about the importance of network neutrality, and had succeeded in uniting radically different people to understand the essential character of the internet as this free and equal, I think, platform. I'm relatively optimistic about people's understanding about that, but I'm still deeply concerned that that's going to be swamped by the money dynamic that's going to be play out when the telecom bill is opened up again. So that's why I've kind of decided to step away from these fights that used to be everything I did. Network neutrality was everything I did. SOPA PIPA, that was everything I did. In the old days, to try to address, as Aaron said, we had to do the underlying conditions that make all of these fights seem so impossibly difficult. And if we don't solve that, if we don't find a way to solve that, then I don't, ultimately see how we address and win on issues like network neutrality or copyright regulation or privacy or any of these other areas where we don't have the attention to rally 5 million people on every policy issue that Congress ought to be addressing. We instead should create a Congress that has the independence and the freedom to just get the answer right without worrying about how the funding drives them one way or the other.
Okay, so I'm going to take 3 more. Wow, that was weird. I'll take 3 more questions, and then I encourage you all to continue the conversation over drinks and desserts. And I see your hand.
I'm John Hanchek. I think a lot about this in terms of macroeconomics, because we live in a time of cybernetic capitalism, right? This is more pervasive. So we won a great victory here, but this is more pervasive. This is architectural in the nature of capitalism itself. If you look back in the past, this power dynamic has always been there. Power laws have always scaled this way. And now we have a network that information can flow at near zero marginal cost, right? But then pools. So actually, I want to get us in the framework of thinking about this from the application layer. Something like Facebook, something like Twitter, something like Google, these are centralized pools of information. And we know that information is power. We know this. And it's going to become ever more that way. So it's interesting to focus on the hardware layer of the internet. But I think it's time for us to really start thinking about the software layer and the actual power dynamics. Because anytime you make an application in the modern internet, no matter how good your intentions are, it will be, by architecture, a centralized database that has servers work. So I guess I'm really excited that you've switched to doing this kind of a study, because my favorite of your work is the idea that code is law. And we have the architectures out there, the decentralized architectures, databases like the blockchain, these kinds of things that allow us to build applications that are literally not centralized. Thank you. But seriously, I want to get everyone thinking about this, and I want everyone's contributions on this, because this is a lot of thinking we need to do, but it needs radically rethinking. It means going back to before capitalism existed and asking, why is it this way? What do we want it to continue this way? Money is a tool, it's a technology. It can be changed even. Even money can be changed. I think Bitcoin, Dogecoin showed us that. You can make this stuff out of thin air. It's the information, it's the power. So this is not even necessarily a question, this is a manifesto, but we're in a revolutionary spirit and I appreciate that. So I invite everyone to, let's talk about this, and your comments please, because you're seminal on this kind of idea. So thank you.
Does anyone have a question?
Let's do that. So what you're saying is my warning.
Sorry, yes, you are.
Mike Nelson. I now work with Cloudflare, a small disruptive startup out in the Bay Area. I agree with what you said about corruption, but there's another problem here that you haven't talked about, which is complexity. And Werner Wengi has talked about how complexity is the end of all great civilizations. The noted political scientist Dilbert talks about not monopolies and duopolies, but the power of confusopolies. And we've seen this time and again, where a simple idea gets turned into a 300-page bill, which then gets used against the citizen and against the small company. Is there any counterbalance, any counter-pressure to the tendency of our political system to produce more and more layers of regulation, often well-intended regulation, that gets used by the powerful people to squash innovation and to protect their monopolies or confusopolies?
So I once knew this guy named Mike Nelson. That's that guy. Who told me a story that leads me to believe that unless we solve the problem I'm talking about, the answer to your question is no. And the story is, yeah, there's complexity, but complexity is 1,000 opportunities for power to leverage control inside the system. So the lobbying machine wants complexity, wants 1 billion places where it could have to negotiate over something, because that's 1 billion clients that it could be hiring to engage in the process of negotiating over something. Even something as fundamental, and this ties to the story that I once heard from your corner of the world, something as fundamental as, when libertarians talk about shrinking the size of government. The last time we had a fight on the Telecommunications Act, one of the core questions was whether we would deregulate a significant chunk of the telecommunications industry. And I heard it said that there was a significant pushback on Capitol Hill from deregulating, with the slogan, if we deregulate these guys, how are we going to raise money from them? How are we going to raise money from them? Right? So the very idea that we regulate, in part driven by the notion that this gives us, as Peter Schweitzer would say, more points of extortion inside of the system, makes it hard to think about getting a sensible answer to these complex problems. So I don't think it's possible to imagine simplicity. But I do think it's possible to imagine removing the incentives to exploit complexity in this way that's completely perverse from the perspective of what's in the public good. And if you could remove that incentive enough, by, I think, addressing this fundamental corruption, then yeah, we're going to have to muddle through with hard problems that we're not going to get perfectly right. But we're not going to be systematically getting it wrong because there's millions of dollars to be made by forcing us to get it wrong.
Okay, I'll take one last question, and then again, I do encourage everybody to stay after for drinks and desserts across the hall.
I'm John Zengus with DC Media Group. Professor Lessig, does the success of the net neutrality campaign provide a model for other movements, and if so, how?
So what's striking about network neutrality is, unlike SOPA, it's not about stopping something. It's actually about building pressure to get the government to do something. Right? Now, it's not to get Congress to do something. We haven't yet demonstrated we have the power to motivate Congress to actually propose reform and to enact it. But the idea that the power, again, you guys were first in this in 2004 or 2005?
2005, 2006.
Yeah. But then many others have built on, including the group that Aaron started, Demand Progress, which has done an enormous amount to push this, has created leverage enough pressure inside of the administration and then inside the agencies to get them to actually do something as opposed to blocking them from doing something. That's a big change. That's a phased shift in the organizing space. And of course, I don't think it's simple to go from motivating the FCC to do something to motivating Congress to do something. But it is the next step. We have to think about what now scales to get us so that this rhythm of activism can then have enough power to force Congress to take the next step.
Well, let's pretend for a second, as I abuse my moderator privilege, that, so SOPA was this amazing thing that did happen in Congress. I remember sitting in an airport and seeing it pop up on headline news and being like, oh my God, we're actually going to win this thing. And partly because we learned how much reporters use Wikipedia. It was an amazing thing that happened. But as you say, this is the last place to get it in so many ways. And for a lot of people that go to work in the Capitol every day, what they took away from SOPA was, oh my gosh, now we can go raise money from Silicon Valley. So I want you, Lawrence Lessig, to imagine, here we are, a genie shows up here in the sub-basement of the Capitol, and it says, okay, you can have one wish, one thing that you can absolutely make Congress do. It can't be more wishes. What is that one thing, even if they're not the answer, but you would say, okay, if you get this one thing done now, what would you ask of them?
Yeah, that's great. That's the question that I think we don't talk enough about, and it is the only hope for making this happen. We have to change the way we fund elections. So here's a word that's not permitted to be uttered here in Washington. We have to publicly fund elections.
Undercurrent under the surface makes the mainstream get so nervous. It's time for purpose, for news to serve us, not with propaganda they use to hurt us.